Well, hello, New Life Church. Glad to have you joining us for the message this week. I was wondering this week how many company logos we recognize just by looking at them. Some of the more familiar ones, the golden arches, we immediately think of McDonald's. Jolly Green Giant, you think of vegetables. Apple computers, they have an apple with a bite that's taken out of it. John Deere tractors. We think of a green deer jumping, like they have in their logo. And those logos, and obviously hundreds, thousands of other ones, they make us think of things. Some of them can actually make us feel things. You think of the golden arches, and I think of French fries, which I love, which I know are really not nutritious for me. I think of the Jolly Green Giant, and I can't help but think of vegetables that I really don't appreciate all that much, like lima beans. Apple computers, and I think technology, especially technology that doesn't make sense to me. And then the John Deere reminds me of my father-in-law, who has restored tractors throughout his retirement years. And of course, in Christianity, we have a symbol that means a lot to us. It is the cross. We put it on church buildings. We put it in the front of our churches. We have it on church logos. It is probably the most popular symbol that is on necklaces that both women and men have worn for centuries. I wonder what our feelings are in response to the logo, the symbol of the cross. How many people have warm feelings about it when they see that? How many people have zero emotional attachment to it at all? How many people shudder when they think about it? How many people are flooded with gratitude, which probably would be my most common response when I think about the cross? In Jesus' time, 100% of the people would have shuddered, because it didn't have anything to do with Judaism. It didn't have anything to do with the birth of Christianity at the time. It had everything to do with cruelty, with horrible punishment and terror for those that had to undergo it. Did you know that the crucifixion didn't begin with the Roman Empire? It didn't begin around the time of Jesus' birth. Fully 700 years before Jesus was born, Babylonians or maybe Assyrians seem to have invented crucifixion. Now, invented might not seem like the right word, as if some guy came home and excitedly told his wife, "I got a patent for it, they granted it to me." All right, but the reality is, way back in the Old Testament, Daniel probably was familiar with crucifixions. Maybe Jeremiah was also. And a few hundred years after crucifixion was devised, maybe that's a better term, Alexander the great Greek warrior, plundered Babylon, and he saw crucifixions and he said, "Hey, our army needs to do that." And as a result of that, crucifixions started working their way west into the area around the Mediterranean Sea. It was years after that the Romans saw it, and they became the Olympic champion crucifiers. Around the time of Jesus' birth, there was a Jewish rebellion against Rome that took place. Rome squashed it, and they killed 2,000 Jews, crucifying them on crosses throughout Palestine. How long do you think other Jews could hear the screams of the men being tortured as they echoed through the hills around Jerusalem? And how effective do you think the cross was then as an instrument of intimidation, as an instrument of control, population control, over people groups that surely wished they could overthrow Rome but didn't want to have to experience that again? I want to consider today three things that the cross symbolized. The cross was a symbol of humiliation. It was a bit of an expensive way, actually, to execute prisoners, to execute criminals, because it involved a fair amount of work, and it required, generally speaking, 5 soldiers to oversee it. There were many other cheaper options that the Roman Empire could have used. Periodically, they executed people by stoning them, by burning them at the stake. using a sword to kill them or to cut off their heads, and some of them were simply forced to drink hemlock and were poisoned to death. But when the Romans really wanted to send a message to deter other troublemakers from repeating the crimes of someone that they had caught, someone that was going to be executed, crucifixion was chosen partially because it was so humiliating for those who got crucified. Stripping the person naked was very, very common, all right? But while it is likely that Jesus was crucified totally naked, scholars aren't in full agreement about that because the Bible is a little bit unclear, all right? But in addition to stripping him naked, then the person who would be getting crucified would be mocked. Jesus was mocked by placing a sign over his head saying, here's the King of the Jews. We're told in Mark chapter 15, verse 20, as well as in the other Gospels, that the soldiers mocked Jesus when he was being flawed, when he was being whipped, I guess I could say. In Mark 15, verse 20 also, it says, those who passed by hurled insults at him. 11 verses later, in the same way we read, the chief priests and the teachers of the law mocked him. Verse 32, those crucified with him also heaped insults on him. Humiliation is referred to, or it surfaces nearly 200 times in the Bible. And so I took some time to read many of those this week, and I was intrigued by what humiliation is associated with in the scriptures, or where humiliation comes from. In the book of Esther, chapter 6, the Persian king's chief advisor, his name was Haman. He was forced to publicly honor Queen Esther's uncle, Mordecai, who Haman absolutely despised. After parading and honoring Mordecai through the streets, he rushes home, fleeing back to his house, absolutely mortified at the humiliation of having to honor someone that he hated. Humiliation comes when an enemy gets the upper hand, when an enemy has the last word, when an enemy gets honored instead of us. This is actually a big deal for sports fans. It's one of the reasons that makes it hard for Minnesotans to be loyal to our Minnesota teams, because rarely do we get the honors, rarely do we win the championships. But if the main way that God allows us in Minnesota to be humiliated is by having bad sports teams, think about it, it could be a lot worse. In 2 Samuel chapter 10, King David sends a delegation to the new king in the territory of the Ammonites, which was right nearby Israel. And that king, instead of welcoming the delegation, he decides to humiliate the men. He shaves off half of their beards, and then he cuts off their garments halfway up their buttocks. And the men are so humiliated by this that David sends them to the city of Jericho until their beards could grow back and until their dignity would be restored. So humiliation in these verses is associated with the exposure of our private parts and appearances in general that are devalued in society, such as a clean-shaven face back in that day, or especially a half clean-shaven face. In 2 Samuel chapter 19, David's army defeats the soldiers that were aligned with his rebel son Absalom, and Absalom is killed in the battle. And David has a unique response to this. Okay, he mourns the loss of his son, while the army was expecting him to celebrate the fact that they had quashed the rebellion. And we read in 2 Samuel chapter 19, verse 3, so the army returned to the city quietly that day, like troops come in when they are humiliated after fleeing in battle. Humiliation here comes on soldiers who cowardly retreat from an enemy, refusing to battle and forfeiting themselves, their families, and their country. Well, actually, that's not what took place, but that's what humiliation here is referring to. They came back humiliated as much as an enemy running away, or an army running away from the enemy's army. In Isaiah chapter 30, several hundred years later in Israel's history, they form an alliance with Egypt. And this is what God tells them in Isaiah 30, verse 3. Pharaoh's protection will be to your shame. Egypt's shade will bring you disgrace. So humiliation here is connected with an inability to protect themselves, having to rely on a foreign power rather than being able to stand up on their own. James 1:10 in the New Testament tells us that the rich man will fade away in humiliation because he is like a flower of the grass that only lasts for a short time. So in this verse, humiliation is connected to our inability to prolong life or to control our lives. So humiliation comes when we don't come close to meeting the legitimate expectations that others or that we have for ourselves. Humiliation comes when a weaker person finds himself or herself at the mercy of a stronger and ruthless foe. In comparison with our enemy, Satan, we need to be honest. We are that weaker person. Foundationally, we are weaker without God's strength, at least. Foundationally, we are weaker because our personal choices to sin, as well as mankind's heritage of sin that has been handed down to us through the generations from Adam and Eve, that causes inherent weakness, making us vulnerable to our enemy, Satan. Have you ever considered all the humiliation that we experience that traces back to Adam and Eve's pride, their proud desire to be like God? That's how Satan tempted them when they were in the Garden of Eden. Because of our sin, we cannot prolong life. We cannot control life. In the face of our enemy, we don't have the strength to protect ourselves. Because of sin, also in the face of our enemies, we often run like cowards before challenges that we face and refuse to confront evil the way that we should. As sin and aging advance and have their effect in our bodies, we face the potential humiliation of becoming too old to care for our personal needs and having our nakedness exposed. And without Christ having broken the power of Satan, spiritually our enemy would also get the upper hand and have the final word and bask in his glory over us, except for Christ's power in us. So because of our own choices, mankind's choices, our own personal choices, we are subject to all different types of humiliation. But Jesus in his purity, Jesus with his power, should have to experience no humiliation. He deserved none of it. And while we often talk about Jesus dying for us, about Jesus suffering for us, rarely do we meditate on how much he was humiliated for us. Total exposure, total powerlessness, total defeat, at least apparent defeat. The cross is a symbol of that humiliation. Second, the cross is a symbol of suffering. We're a little bit more familiar with this. Criminals about to be crucified were usually stripped of their clothes, and then they were tied to a post. And they would be flogged like Jesus was flogged, as we learn about in Mark 15, verse 15, as well as all of the other Gospels. Scourged with whips that had pieces of rock or glass that were tied to the ends of the leather strips in order to tear the skin more deeply, in order to tear the skin more fully and more effectively, would have been their thoughts. They seem to have been tied to the post. Criminals were quite tightly so that they couldn't run away or they couldn't squirm away from the punishment that they were supposed to endure. But the effect, an extra effect of that also was that the skin on their backs would be pulled tight and the skin on their legs would also be stretched tighter, which would have maximized the pain and it would have led to deeper gashes. For those who saw the movie The Passion of the Christ about 15 years ago, the scene of Jesus being whipped likely wasn't exaggerated in its brutality. As I sat watching it in a theater in Africa back during that year, my Muslim friend who watched it next to me, he was squirming in his chair. I could hear him literally groaning within himself. And there were times when he couldn't watch the screen any longer during that horrific whipping scene that took place. The Romans became experts at whipping and beating a person to within a fraction of his life. And that was just the lead-in up to the crucifixion. With open wounds then on their backs and on their shoulders, the criminals condemned to death would be forced to carry what oftentimes would have been a 100-pound crossbar, which would have just added insult to injury, or actually added insult and more injury to the injury and wounds that they already had. Then their arms would be oftentimes roped to the cross before they were nailed to the cross. And then they would be propped up on the cross, because the purpose was asphyxiation, as their lungs couldn't exhale without the person pushing up with his feet, which were then nailed to a piece of wood further down on the cross. That the only possibility for them to be able to gain breath would be to pull up and push down on their feet and pull up with their arms to be able to fill their lungs with breath once again. I read online where German scientists studied crucifixion back in the 1960s. Now, they didn't nail nails through the wrists of any of the people in the study, but they studied just the effect at one point of tying a person's arms to cross beams like that, and then having them hang in the air like that. They found out that the pain for their subjects was so severe that it became intolerable for them after more than 30 minutes. So here's what they did. They actually stopped the experiment early, and never completed it, because the pain of that alone was too great. That's without any nails going into their wrists or going into their feet. Remember again what Jesus says in Luke 9, verse 23. If anyone would come after me, he must deny himself and take up his cross daily and follow me. Now, when Jesus is telling his disciples and telling all of us who are followers of him to take up our cross, and knowing that the cross was synonymous with horrific suffering from before the time of they were even in contact with the cross, through the whippings and then the carrying of the cross and then actually being nailed to the cross. Knowing all of that, how have Christ followers ever conceived that we should be able to avoid suffering in this Christian life? You can't carry a cross without some form of suffering. The author Kyle Eidemann asks these questions. When is the last time that following Jesus cost you something significant? When is the last time that it cost you a relationship? When is the last time that following Jesus cost you a promotion, or cost you being treated fairly at work? When is the last time you were ridiculed, where you were mocked or insulted for your faith? When is the last time you went without even just one meal for Jesus' sake, in order perhaps to help someone else, or in order to spend that time in prayer, in fasting, developing a relationship with Jesus? Can you really say you are carrying your cross if it doesn't cost you anything, if it hasn't led to any form of suffering, no matter how minor? So the cross was a symbol of humiliation. The cross was a symbol of suffering. And finally, as we're all familiar with, the cross was a symbol of death. Paul wrote in Philippians chapter 2, verse 9, that Jesus became obedient to death. Yes, even to the point of death on a cross. Anyone in Jerusalem during that horrific weekend who somehow had remained oblivious and unknowing of the events that were taking place, of the arrest of Jesus, of the trial of Jesus, but who happened to be walking through the city not too far from Calvary when they saw Jesus, this man, carrying a cross on his bloody shoulders. Anyone, without knowing what had taken place up until that point in time, without being told what was going to be taking place after that, would have immediately thought, this man is going to be dead in a matter of hours, or at the most by tomorrow. If you saw an eighth grade boy on an October afternoon carrying a football helmet, you would rightly conclude that he's a football player and on his way to practice or to a game. If you saw an 11th grade girl carrying a tennis racket, you'd probably guess that she is headed to the tennis courts and is a member of the tennis team here at the high school. If you saw a 10th grade boy carrying a skateboard, you'd immediately think there's a kid who's going to the hospital after he goes to the skate park first and probably gets injured, all right? Nobody seeing Jesus carrying a cross would have concluded, looks like he's going on a missions trip. And the early disciples, who all heard Jesus' command to take up their cross daily, they knew, particularly after they had seen what took place at the end of his life on that hill on Calvary, they knew that by obeying that commandment to take up their cross, they were committing themselves, not just to following Jesus, but they were committing themselves to being treated horrifically as well. History tells us that almost all of those original disciples literally gave their lives directly tied to that commitment to follow after Jesus. Tradition tells us, and it could be wrong, okay, but church tradition that goes back to writers, Jewish writers from the very first century AD, tell us that Matthew was speared to death in Ethiopia, that Mark died in Egypt after being dragged by horses through the streets of the city. Luke was hanged in Greece. Peter refused to be crucified like Jesus and requested to be crucified upside down. The decision was made by Nero. I can't imagine the pain of having your body put upside down and then being crucified. The pain of the blood rushing to his head. Thomas was stabbed with a spear, bringing the gospel to India. Jude, who was Jesus' brother, was shot and killed by arrows. John, the disciple, wasn't martyred, but he was thrown into a pot of boiling oil, somehow survived that, and then was sent into exile to die on an island called Patmos, an island of modern-day Greece. I thought of these guys, and I think it's likely that when they were in their teens or when they were in their 20s, every one of these disciples imagined what their lives would look like when they were going to be 50 and 60 and maybe as old as 70 if they happened to live that long. I bet Luke could picture himself as a respected physician, serving as the mayor or as the elder statesman of the town that he lived in. Matthew, I can imagine, probably figured that he was going to be rich and retired and probably still unappreciated, and so maybe he was thinking, when this is all done, I got to move away from my fellow Jews in Israel, and I can imagine he thought, maybe I'll have a beautiful home on the seashore just north of Israel in Lebanon. Peter and John certainly had to think, the fishing boats have gotten passed on to us from our dads, we'll pass them on to our sons, we'll watch our sons work with our grandsons as well and live in modest homes by the Sea of Galilee, enjoying the sunrise as it comes up every morning. Not one of them would have imagined getting beaten up for following a preacher who claimed to be Israel's Messiah. They couldn't imagine leaving their families to move to Greece or to Turkey or to Egypt to tell people who had no clue about Jesus Christ what he had done for them. They certainly never thought that they would become public enemy number one for government leaders all the way from India to Ethiopia and on up into Rome and Italy. Yet, knowing that many of the kids that they grew up with, many of the young men that they worked alongside as fishermen or as tax collectors or maybe as physicians in Luke's case, that they would grow old with their grandsons bouncing on their knees as babies, knowing that could have been their future, these men still opt for something that was totally off the radar screen until this rabbi came along and looked at them and said, "Come and follow me." Eventually, follow me to the cross. Think of this. They all start out as quiet, peace-loving Jews on a fairly safe career path. Like us, really. But they become so committed to following the radical teachings of the guy who has changed their lives that they become threats. They become such dangerous threats to the power structures and belief systems of governmental leaders as well as religious leaders among strange ethnic groups that the people stab them with spears, lynch them by dragging them through the streets like the American soldiers in Somalia a generation ago, or they have the people ask Roman soldiers to crucify them, to rid the earth of them. That is the radical difference that the cross meant in their lives. It wasn't a beautiful piece of jewelry. It symbolized humiliation. It symbolized suffering. It symbolized death. The cross was a horrific, life-quaking symbol that didn't leave any of them the same, and it shouldn't leave us the same either. As I finished my thoughts on this message, I reflected a bit on what these dates mean to America, to what they mean to Americans. Thinking back to what happened 20 years ago in our history when the World Trade Center was destroyed on September 11th, an event that also symbolized national humiliation and deep suffering and the death of so many of our fellow citizens. In the weeks after that tragedy, when those two towers were transformed from being symbols of America's might, America's pride, America's financial dominance, those two Trade Center buildings became symbols of our inability to protect ourselves, our inability to control totally our destiny. In the weeks after that tragedy, Americans seemed to feel that faith was needed after all. Church attendance rose dramatically, but within a few months it returned to normal, and sadly, little lasting change was evident in the lives of most Americans. All that pain, all that suffering, all that death. And I don't think we necessarily came out much stronger as a country, nor did we come out much better. What a shame that there wasn't a more radical difference in our lives, in our nation. But go back to the cross. And I ask you, such a symbol that has become an amazingly horrific symbol of humiliation and suffering and death for those of us who call ourselves followers of the one who was crucified on that cross. What is the radical difference that has made in your life? Let's pray. Father God, sometimes we've sanitized the cross. We've made it seem like this is a good symbol. And in some respects it is, but ultimately it is a symbol that represented humiliation and suffering and death to everyone during the time of Jesus. And forgive us, God, for whitewashing it and not realizing that just as Jesus took up his cross and underwent all of that humiliation and suffering and death, undeservedly, took our humiliation on himself, took our suffering on himself, took our death on himself. Just as he was willing to do that, oh God, would you make each person watching this message, would you make us willing to similarly undergo any humiliation, undergo any suffering, even undergo death, because we have determined that we will follow Jesus Christ at all costs. I pray that for myself. I pray that for each person watching, and I ask it in our Savior's name, Jesus Christ. Amen. Thanks for being with us today. I hope that you have a wonderful week. God bless you all.